All right, I am Paul DeZiel from District 3, and I'm here to call together the Public Works Committee for this special meeting tonight. And our first order of business here is roll call, which I think Sarah and I are both here and Dean's here. Mike is not here tonight, is that right?
Yep, he had a conflict tonight, so just me tonight.
Okay, awesome. We are going with comments and suggestions from citizens present. I noticed Mary Claire is online. Did you want to talk about anything, Mary Claire?
No, thank you so much. I'm just here to listen tonight. Thank you.
Got it. I'm not seeing anybody else, if I'm not mistaken, so we'll move on to new business, which is a discussion and possible action regarding long-term infrastructure funding. So I think, Dean, you're going to handle that piece.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight in a special meeting to talk about our long-term infrastructure. I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you guys can see that. Let me know if you can. Looking good? Okay.
It looks good, Dean.
Okay, perfect. So I just want to run through this memo that I put together in regards to long-term infrastructure funding, plan options, and then proposed investment framework. So where this came from is a result of some comments that I received, particularly from the business community during our informational meetings regarding the transportation utility and wheel tax that we had back in October, November. And it was kind of pretty consensus in that meeting, and Mary Claire can probably vouch for this, that the business community in particular, but others probably also felt that they wanted to see, like, what's our long-term plan so that we know if we are asking for more funding that it is going to get us to where we need to be, rather than just asking for more funding as just nebulous out there, like, is this enough, is it too much, is it not enough, or whatever. Just, I guess, have a plan to shoot for so that we can kind of fill in the details with the discussion about the transportation utility or whatever after that. So I thought that was a great comment, and I appreciate the feedback from the public on that. And so that's kind of where this came tonight. And then the investment framework, which I'll talk about, it also came out of that same meeting, and just the questions about, okay, so if we, have $1 million, just for example, $1 million in a year, like, are we going to use that to go rebuild some cul-de-sac or an alley, or, something that sees 2 cars a day, over repaving an arterial street like, Crestview Drive or Carmichael Road or something like that, and what's keeping us on track for investing in a wise and cost-efficient manner, right? And so having that framework kind of agreed upon was also important to that community, or the people in that room at that meeting. So I thought that was a very apt comment as well. So I just wanted to run through this memo and get your guys' feedback now, and then talk through where to go from here. And I also have some additional information about the state of the transportation utility here at the city's level, and then also at the state legislature level as well. So the first thing is, before talking about long-term, we have to kind of talk about what we're doing right now. Is what we're doing right now meeting our needs, or will it meet our needs into the future? The city on an annual basis, average the last 5 or so years has spent about $1.3 million a year on infrastructure maintenance, reconstruction, sidewalks, curb and gutter, et cetera. And so running the numbers on into the future, what that looks like, over time, the power of the dollar decreases over time with inflation, and also just as we are unable to, repave a street when it needs to be repaved, and it just slides into a condition that needs to be reconstructed instead. We've been over that in previous conversations with you guys as well. So the fact of kind of as status quo, I guess, with our $1.3 million, or what we've been doing recently, is that in not even that long, say 10 to 15 years time, our minor streets are going to be really suffering in a condition that is not going to be very well tolerated, I think, by the public. And then also, even our major streets, we can keep that at a higher level, but they're going to be at a point where at some point they're also going to be in a condition that's not good. We'll say that way. And as we've mentioned before, kind of the ideal of where street ratings should be, to be in a most cost-effective way to maintain them, is up in that like 7 to 8 pacer rating range. And if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to be in the 2 to 4 range, something like that. Right now, our average street is at about a 5.0 out of 10 rating, as we just redid the ratings last year. So that's obviously not good, and that's something that I would like to avoid if at all possible. And I'm sure that well, I guess I shouldn't speak for you guys, but I would imagine that you guys also don't want to see streets that are falling apart in our city either. So also, talking about this too, at some point in time, we've already got utility mains in the ground that are 100+ years old, and if we keep not replacing those over time either with street reconstruction projects and whatnot, either water mains are going to start springing leaks, and sanitary sewers are going to start collapsing and that kind of thing. The Hudson Public Utilities, at some point in time, will have to come through, maybe even on their dime, to rebuild some of these roads, but then they're paying for that as well. And then there'd be a separate conversation about, why are my water rates so high, or why are my sanitary sewer rates so high? And it's essentially because we're not being more proactive in replacing these streets that need to be replaced. So looking at potential long-term funding scenarios. So obviously, as we've discussed before, this is not something that we're going to get out of in a short period of time. It will have to be, a longer period of time, longer than certainly I would like to think about, but just in the reality of things, I put together 5 different options of potential long-term funding scenarios I'll go through as well. But just kind of framework, all these options are 30 to 50-year plans, meaning that at the end of that time frame, the infrastructure is essentially caught up, so that we're not behind anymore, but we're at the point where we need to to keep up on it into the future. All plans start at the same kind of base level. Construction inflation is in there. It's assumed at 2% per year. Made some assumptions about how things are getting reconstructed, and particularly our busier streets would be reconstructed with concrete pavement for longevity. That's even something that our business community mentioned in our meetings, is that we need to be rebuilding our streets in a fashion that's going to support the truck traffic and whatever that these businesses generate and whatnot. And that's certainly something that I would like to see as well. Costs do not include water or sanitary sewer replacements, as those are paid for by the utility, public utilities, so to speak. They've indicated to me, talking with Kip a few times, that essentially they'll follow our lead with our surface and storm sewer reconstruction type stuff, because if they don't have to pay for rebuilding the street because they have to replace the main, then that's much better for their bottom line. So they'll essentially follow our lead on whatever we do. Costs do include estimated future needs due to the sanitary sewer comprehensive plan, that kind of stuff. We didn't include costs for streets that aren't in the city's control as of right now, which makes sense, I think. Now, I put this together before we adopted the retaining wall policy, so these costs don't include the city contributions to retaining walls that were just passed. So those would have to get wrapped in, just to some extent as well. They don't include outside funding sources for grants. I'll get into that in a minute too, but except for some projects that we know we can't construct without grants, like reconstructing Carmichael Road north of 94, because that's in and of itself like a $10 million project. So that's a lot. So with all these, I wanted to also kind of throw out some benchmarks so we can compare these different options to each other, to make sure that we can kind of see how the different funding levels and more, if we spend more upfront, what does that do for ratings and whatnot, or versus deferring it till later, that kind of thing. So the three kind of benchmarks that I put in there are the average pacer ratings. So that's again the average pavement ratings for our streets in town. Like I said before, getting those ratings to a point that they're between 7 and 8 is kind of the most cost-effective range to maintain that pavement. And then also throw in an estimate of the projected percentage of streets at pacer rating 1 to 2. So that was essentially, what percentage of our roads are really, really bad in any given year. So that's, based on an estimated rate of pavement degradation over time. That's, from studies that multiple places have put out in the past. Generally, obviously, we want to minimize that percentage and get it as low as possible, as quickly as possible, so that we don't have to, be chasing potholes all over town. And also, at some point in time, if the street gets bad enough, we'd have to turn it to gravel, and people don't want to see that either. And then regarding the utilities underground, looking at miles of streets with 120-year-old utilities or more, which is over the replacement age, essentially. So reducing that number of utilities that are that old helps us to keep us from playing whack-a-mole with, bursting pipes and that kind of thing, which is disruptive and costly. So a quick run through these options. The first option is a 30-year plan. That's a longer phase-in plan. This is what the graph looks like. It phases in over a period of what is that, like 15 years or something like that, and then decreases from there. It gets our average pacer ratings up to reasonable standard. Your arterial streets would be up in the reasonable standard in say 5 to 10 years from now, and then the minor streets catch up later on in about 20 years from now. The percentage of bad streets essentially peaks at about 50% in about 5 or so years from now, and then decreases over time. And then our amount of mains in the ground that are really old decreases to about 0 by the time about 20 years out. Option 2 represents a little bit more aggressive of a phase-in. Phases in over about a 10-year period, and then slowly decreases after that. That allows us to get the street ratings for minor streets up to a reasonable point in about less than 20 years, and the arterial streets would be in a good point before then as well. Decreases the peak of the bad streets, and then also gets us to a point where we're not dealing with rating 1 or 2 streets earlier as well, and then cuts down that amount of old mains in the ground for utilities, and shaves off a few years with getting those utilities replaced. Option 3 is a much quicker phase-in. The phase-in happens over about a 5-year period, and then kind of essentially stays flat or decreases from there. That gets our streets up to a good point, even sooner, and then decreases the amount of bad streets that we have to deal with. And essentially the moral of the story with those three is that the more you invest up front, or within the next, say, 5 to 10 years, the more you can stave off the bad pavement conditions and get our mains in the ground replaced faster as well. Option 4 is a 40-year plan. So essentially, 40-year plan, you increase that phase-in period longer, and then levels off and then decreases after that. As you might imagine, that means that our street pavement conditions get up to a better level at a longer period of time. So arterial streets, we get up to that 7 threshold in about 15 years. All streets would get there, say 30 or so years from now. And then the percentage of bad streets in town peaks higher, and also takes longer to essentially get rid of for that 40-year plan. And then the 50-year plan essentially does the same thing. It's just phases in even longer. Those street ratings, don't get up to a good, that point, the 7 to 8 point for longer as well. And then, we still are dealing with bad streets for a longer period of time. So with all that, do you have any, before I move on, I guess, the funding components, do you guys have any questions just right now about those 5 options or any of the graphs that I showed?
I have just a couple. Well, I was just going to say thank you. This is obviously, I feel like you just have made a thesis here. So obviously I've done a ton of work on coming up with viable options. I'm wondering, so thank you. With cities that are kind of a comparable size, what do you see kind of what, it sounds like this is not unusual to be in this predicament. What do you think other cities are kind of, not that I want a comparison, but what do you think is kind of more the norm on fixing something like this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. I did, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I did kind of look at some comparable cities to us, like what they have been, like what their average has been, over the past few years. Yeah. And especially many of our peer cities have been investing more in their infrastructure, historically. So we're probably a little bit behind the 8 ball, compared to others. The other thing I will say too is that I don't believe other cities have been looking as closely into, the future as we have been with this. There's really not a requirement for cities to look, into the future so far for, infrastructure. I feel like it's kind of professional obligation to let you guys know, sound the alarm bell, make sure that we're not falling into state of disrepair and then wonder how we got here, that kind of thing. And I think cities that don't do their homework with regard to, something like this are going to find themselves there at some point in time if they haven't been investing enough in the future. So I don't want to be that. I think that some of our peers will probably find themselves there. So that being said, I think we will probably, if any of these options are adopted, we probably would be spending more than our peer cities on our infrastructure maintenance and upkeep. But I think if they did the same analysis, I think they would come up with similar results. I don't think we're unique in the fact that we have a lot of aging infrastructure and we haven't been taking care of it as well as we should have. So does that answer your question? Kind of, yes. Okay.
It's mud. But yes, thank you.
Okay. Al, did you have anything?
Not clarifications.
Yeah.
I want you to go through and then I have some maybe questions at the end, if that's okay, or some comment. I want to make sure that you get a chance to present everything first.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So obviously when I present a graph that looks like this, there's a overarching number per year that we'd be spending on, infrastructure maintenance and upkeep. But within that, $1 amount, there's, how do we fund that, $5 million, in this option in, 2025 or something like that. The various components that we have at our disposal, the usual suspect, I guess, is bonding, which is paid for by property taxes. The other, typical way that cities fund these projects are through special assessments. That being, essentially we do a project, repave, reconstruct, whatever, and then charge a percentage of that cost to the adjacent property owners because of the benefit to their property from keeping the street up to a decent condition. The wheel tax is something we haven't employed to this point, but it's something that other communities have done in the state of Wisconsin. I believe there's something like 30 communities that have a wheel tax now in 10 counties, something like that, of various levels. The transportation utility, obviously, we've been discussing that for a while now, and that's kind of the unique thing that we've been discussing to this point. And then grants and special funding, that obviously being, things like what we've talked about in the past, like the STP program and the federal build grant and that kind of thing. Special funding, obviously special is in the word, so it's not something you can take for granted every year, and it's very competitive. So that's difficult to bank on. Obviously we'll continue to go for those grants and whatnot. And if we do, receive grants for projects that are in our long-term infrastructure, if we receive money for that, we'd probably offset either bonding, or if we adopted a transportation utility, offset the costs that we'd be trying to charge through that, or keep those things at the same level and then advance construction of a project that had been scheduled for a future year or something like that. So that being said, we have to make sure that we're under the limits that are imposed upon us by the state. In this case, so there's two limits that cities have to generally fall under. The first one is property tax levy limit, and the second one is the borrowing limit. So the property tax levy limit essentially caps how much property tax you can charge to the residents, businesses, whatever in the city. A quirk of Wisconsin law is that you can pass along property tax levies without having to deal with the property tax levy limit if you're paying off bonds. That isn't subject to the property tax levy limit, which is interesting and kind of it helps us in this discussion, so we don't have to necessarily abide by that limit. The problem is that, so there's the borrowing limits, which is set at I think 5% of the total value of all the properties in the city, limits, that kind of thing. And if we, our property or our bond borrowing limit right now is something like $120 million or something like that. So we can't necessarily just max out that borrowing to, tomorrow we're going to bond for $120 million to, get rid of all of our infrastructure backlog or whatever. Once we get to essentially over 50% of our borrowing limit, then our bond rating starts to go down. So that means that we'd be paying more interest in our bonds. That'd be, bad things would happen essentially if we got close to our borrowing limits. So we don't want to get essentially below 50% of our borrowing limits so that we don't have unintended problems with that. We also obviously have other needs in the city that are outside of infrastructure that would need to be paid for by bonds. New police car, fire engine, or snow plowing truck or something like that. So we put that in there as well. Plus, we also know that we need a new public works building. So that's also in there as well. So with all that considered, for each of these options I showed you earlier, there's kind of a mix of alternatives funding alternatives that we ran. They're all the same kind of, the letters are the same for each option. So alternative A for each option is essentially only funding from bonding and property taxes and special assessments and a wheel tax. So no transportation utility adopted. So what is that? Essentially, that tells us what our special assessment number would have to be to do any of these plans. And we'll get into that's going to be a lot. The second alternative B for each option would be retaining a small amount of special assessments, about 10% of project costs, which more or less jives with what we charge right now. Implementing the wheel tax and also a transportation utility at the minimum amount that would be necessary to avoid hitting our borrowing limits through the rest of the funding would have to be through bonding. Alternative C for each option would include no special assessments, but would include the wheel tax, the minimum amount of transportation utility necessary for avoiding borrowing limit problems, and then obviously the remaining amount would be funded by bonding. And then alternative D would be no special assessments, and then essentially it would look to use the transportation utility as a way to eliminate or substantially decrease the amount that we're bonding as soon as feasible. So that would ramp up the transportation utility
So Dean,
more sooner.
Can I just cut in a second? It's
Yeah.
kind of hard to, can you make your screen a little bit bigger? It's really hard to see those little boxes as we're looking at the piece here. No, I mean, can you make can you like pull it out somehow? Make it.
You know how it says 100%? Maybe make it, as somebody who has to do this all the time, make it 125%. Oh,
There
like that?
there we go.
Okay.
Yay.
So I'm not going to go through every single number that's in these tables because I think it's mostly just tells us some overarching things. Essentially, for alternative A for each option, essentially we would have to increase special assessments up to essentially 65 to 75% of project costs if we didn't have a transportation utility in order to fund these any of these options essentially, which is a lot. And to give you some perspective, if you were reconstructing a street in front of a single family residential at 60 foot of frontage, just a regular residential street, that's essentially about a $20,000 special assessment for that property. That's just for the reconstruction part. We'd have to add special assessments for things like mill and overlays and that kind of thing too. So that's a lot. If there's no way
for businesses, it would be huge because they have such a huge amount of
frontage.
property.
Yep. And I have a few different examples of, say, like, County Market or Quick Trip or something like that, what the special assessment amounts would be, for them if we had to go to that level, which is a lot. Going through all these transportation utility things is not really worth it to get in the weeds here, but essentially a few things to just glean from this is that, if we didn't adopt a transportation utility, given the parameters that we have to work with, the special assessment rate would have to go up substantially. If we adopt, there's no way to both get rid of special assessments and not have a transportation utility. So that's some of the big picture things that I wanted to glean from this. A few things too, as we think about bonding, what I went through assumes, the interest rates that are on bonds right now that are relatively low. Obviously, as the as we know, inflation is high right now, and the Federal Reserve is looking to probably increase interest rates for borrowing, and that would affect us to some extent at some point in the future, borrowing for projects. And then obviously, the more interest you have to pay, the less you're getting for for your buck, you know, and that could also affect our bond rating and that kind of thing. It also, you know, obviously also impacts, you know, our ability to bond for things that are not infrastructure needs, you know, parks and buildings, everything we've built and everything we drive and everything we, you know, stuff like that eventually has to be replaced, and we can't do that as effectively if we have to bond more for infrastructure maintenance. So I say all this, and also wanted to, this is probably a good time to insert that there is a current proposal at the state legislature to effectively kill this transportation utility movement as well. So what the bill that's circulating right now essentially says that if a city adopts a transportation utility, every dollar that they raise with the transportation utility would go against the property tax levy limit, which which we already are very constrained with our property tax levy limit in, well, every municipality is in Wisconsin. So that would effectively mean we could not adopt a transportation utility if that bill went through. So right now we're kind of in limbo on the transportation utility discussion, pending kind of what happens with that. But obviously, as we've discussed this, it seems like you know, if we were allowed to do it, that this would be a, you know, a pretty reasonable way to share costs with, or raise money that's needed for taking care of our infrastructure. But yeah, obviously that will be depending on what happens with that discussion at the legislature.
You know when that's on the floor for discussion?
I do not. Right now, I think they're circulating for sponsors for the bill. So I on a personal level reached out to our representative and senator just to kind of, you know, tell them, hey, not on, you know, the city's not making me do this. I'm just talking to you on my own, you know, accord here, but just keep in mind, if you do adopt this, that this would be really detrimental to not only our city, but just, you know, municipalities in general. You know, at some point in time, we're gonna have to, you know, be investing in our infrastructure, and having fewer options is not good. You know, regardless of if we in the city of Hudson adopt a transportation utility, having fewer tools in the toolbox is not good for everybody, I think. So that was just on my own accord. But if you guys feel the same way, definitely, you know, contact the powers that be in the legislature to make sure that doesn't go through. And like I said, that's regardless of whether or not the city of Hudson itself adopts this or not. More tools in the toolbox, the better, in my mind. But so that's where we're at with that. And obviously we've pushed pause on our public outreach with this, because if that goes through and we have no ability to do this anymore, it doesn't make sense to, you know, be talking with the public about it if it's not going to happen, or has no chance of happening, I should say. So just wanted to throw that out there.
But if you adopt it and you have it going before they pass the law, you're not grandfathered in?
Not according to that bill that's circulating right now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Ian, did you want to finish the
Yeah.
priorities piece at the end here?
Yep. Thank you. So that being said, with any amount of infrastructure maintenance funding that we adopt, we want to make sure that we're spending our money wisely, so to speak. So we want to make sure that, you know, first, that if we have a limited amount of funds, you know, each year, that we're using that money to benefit the most people, you know, that use our streets and sidewalks and trails on a regular basis. So I came up with a proposed framework. I just wanted to run through this real quick. First would be, if we have matching cost obligations for available grants, we're going to fund those first, right? So if we're going to get quote unquote free money from the federal government or state government, we want to make sure that we've ponied up our cost share. Second would be low cost maintenance activities like crack filling, steel coating, et cetera, on our higher volume streets, which we've been essentially doing the past couple of years to make sure that our higher volume streets are in good condition. Third would be annual funding for maintenance activities I'll get to that in a second. So things like sidewalks, curb and gutter, spot repair, that kind of stuff, retaining walls now that we've adopted that policy, that kind of thing. The fourth one would be reconstructions as necessary to provide for the sanitary sewer comprehensive plan upgrades. So to allow our community to continue to grow, we got to upsize mains in places, so making sure that can happen. Fifth would be low cost maintenance activities on lower volume streets. And that kind of goes into medium cost activities like repaving. I'm sorry if you hear crying kids downstairs. They've apparently gone crazy downstairs. And then after that, essentially getting into reconstruction activities on higher volume streets and the reconstruction on lower volume streets. So that item 3, the standing maintenance activities, like I said, having a certain amount for trail maintenance in a year, sidewalk maintenance in a year, curb and gutter, retaining walls, and I added a line for some public safety improvements so that if we have issues that the public safety committee has on a year-to-year basis, we're not fighting for dollars for making needed safety improvements as well. So that was essentially my list for the framework there. So essentially, the next steps would be to discuss, first of all, if this committee is on board with any of these, long-term infrastructure options. Secondly, is this framework that I went through reasonable? Is it on board with, or are you on board with kind of what we have in here? Is there things that we should change in that list? And then I forget what I had for the third thing on my issue sheet here. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll up here real quick to remind myself. And then what funding components to continue pursuing for investing in this in our infrastructure needs. Obviously, this is a massive conversation. We've been having this conversation for a while. It's kind of the next step forward. There's some unknowns with the transportation utility discussion at the legislature level, but want to make sure that we're continuing on our end to keep moving forward regardless of some of those nebulous things out there that are going on. So yeah, thank you, Paul, for speeding me through this. I know we got places to be, the diversity committee tonight, but I wanted to at least get the conversation started with this stuff. So
I appreciate your work. Appreciate your work on this, Dean. Sarah, do you want to go first, or you want me to go first for feedback?
You go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, just I want to echo what Sarah said earlier, that I love the work you do. I love the amount of detail. I love the analysis. We are indebted to you for that. I think that's you've been trying to lay a long-term vision for road repair, and all of this is super, super helpful to us as council members. With that said, the big picture, I'm going to start with the big picture and get smaller first, okay? So the big picture, and I don't want you to feel too discouraged, is that I think the plan as laid out is just not reasonable for the numbers involved. And the reason I'm saying that is that I, for sure, to be clear, want to increase our investment into roads. And I can totally share your concern that we don't want these pacer ratings to be sliding down to the 2s, right? But when I looked at all of the options, some of them are calling for $1 million more each year. And so eventually you get to I think it's like a $15 million range or something on some of those graphs. I think one of them touches at 20. And what I'm thinking is our entire city budget, we're about 12 million a year right now. So as I looked at that, and I'm not disputing the analysis of the numbers, I think you're probably, as close as somebody can get with an estimate. But what I'm thinking is I just think those numbers are just not going to be workable for a city our size. So the big picture, I think, is, and I don't know where we would set it, is to, I hate to say this, but I think it's true, is to kind of lower our expectations a little bit in terms of, we do want to do road repair, but we might not be able to get like all these roads to a pacer level of 7, right? We might look at it and say, like, how could we get our major, roads to, maybe a 7 or something close to a 7, and maybe our minor roads are going to be a 5 or something like that. Because I think you set the bar really high, which I appreciate. You're just basically saying this is the best economical range to be in, and I'm agreeing with you. I'm just trying to kind of shed light on the fact that a city our size, I don't think we can maintain and put in, right, $10-15 million per year for X number of years into that. I just think we don't have the resources, even under the options you listed. So I'm not, again, trying to discourage, because I share the concern. I want to improve city streets, but I guess I'm just trying to say, maybe what would a dialed down version of this look like? And we'd have to talk, with the council about what would the expectations be, what would the pacer ratings be. But that's my first thought, is just that the numbers are just, I don't think, workable for Hudson. The second thing, the second thing is, I think for, I can't remember if it was under assumptions or under funding sources, but I just wanted to remind you that the TIF districts that we have, the tax incremental financing districts, that we should have money in those districts, right? That I know is also going to other things, but anything near the downtown, any street repair near the downtown, right? I forget, it's within a mile or 2 miles. I think you might know that better than I do, but that money would be available. So there might be TIF money. And then eventually those TIF districts are going to be closed out. So whether that's, 10 years from now, whether that's 13 years from now, whether that's 15, I don't know when the city is going to close those out, right? But when those TIF districts get closed out, there should be a lot more cash on hand that could be a funding source for these guys too. So just the idea that there's an additional source of money, I think, that we don't have in the report or the analysis. I think, Dean, are you running out of battery?
I kind of am. Yeah, my computer suddenly just decided it was went really low.
Do you have a plug-in or something? Or
yeah, if you give me just 1 minute, I can go.
Yep,
grab
I'll
that.
just pause here. Sorry.
Okay, 1 sec.
We'll pause for a little bit.
Okay. All right, I'm good to go. Sorry about that.
No worries. So just so you didn't miss it, I wanted to reiterate. So I was talking about the TIF districts, right?
Yep. Yep, I heard that. Oh, yep.
So just that there's going to be money down the road. And I'm just saying that I think that's another potential source that we could somehow, integrate into the potential funding.
Sure.
As far as the other thing I want to say is, the American Rescue Plan money, the ARPA funds, I would really like to see us take a serious amount of that 1.5 million and put that into roads. So I don't think your initial number is unrealistic. I think it was a 2.4 million or something in that range, and we're already spending 1.3, right? So what I'm thinking is if we could shift as much of that ARP money, and I know there's probably a laundry list the city has for other things. I get that. There's other needs. I get that. But if we could shift that and get into that, somewhere into that $2 million range to start, and then I think that would be really helpful. I think the wheel tax you put as one source of funding. I think am I right? It's $20 a vehicle annually.
Yeah, that's what the rate that we had proposed. Yep. Excuse me.
So I think I think that's an affordable thing that I think most people in town would look at and say, this is maybe a good use of money to, especially if they know the condition of the roads and the long-term pacer ratings. I think that's something that would be sort of if I dare use the phrase, kind of a low-hanging fruit that we could start with, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I'm honestly disheartened to hear about the Wisconsin state legislature in terms of, I don't know whether that's going to move forward, but I'd have really serious questions for our legislative representatives as to why the state would be taking control away from the local government. That makes absolutely no sense to me, especially when they already have levy limits put in place. So I'm very concerned about that. And if anyone's watching this tape, I would encourage you to go out and to contact your reps about that, because frankly, it's just not fair. You can't have local communities that have local problems and not allow them to solve it in creative ways and in ways that make sense for each community. That's just not the role of the state legislature. I'm sorry. There was another point, sorry. I did want to say that the framework for the priorities, I think is excellent. I think it's well thought out. I just think it makes a lot of sense to go with the matching, go with the federal grants, go with the state grants, go with, your major throughways first. I really like how you have prioritized those. I think that's a real gift to us, because regardless of the package, regardless of the pacer ratings, regardless of how this all settles down in the near and far future, that gives us a really solid ground to evaluate and to sort of say, this is what we're moving forward. So I was really kind of excited to see that. And I thought that was really well laid out. And I would like council to really just kind of look at that too, in terms of how are we thinking about things, even before we get into, any kind of numbers or rework numbers, if that makes sense at all. So I think I have a few more notes, but I'm going to find them here because I'm scratching them tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to if Sarah has questions or comments.
I think you did an exceptional job there, Paul, outlining concerns like you. I'm super frustrated on the state level. I will definitely be making phone calls on that and encouraging other folks to as well. I have concerns about property tax options. I know the school board is thinking about coming forward, and I just don't think that's a viable thing to ask for it in that route. And that's why I was so excited about this transportation, because I thought it was equitable for everyone. I knew it was going to be a stretch, but I thought it still was it was reasonable. So it breaks my heart that we're in a little bit of a holding pattern and kind of being held hostage while we wait on this. So thank you for giving us this really informative document. I need to spend a lot more time going through it and really getting a better handle on it. What are our steps from here then, Dean? What's next for us?
Yeah, it's a little bit thrown off a bit by that curveball from the legislature, right? So initially we were hoping to, if if we were going to move forward with adopting a transportation utility, to have that decision made, sometime in the next couple months, we'll say, so that we can get moving on implementing it and whatever. So it takes time to gather all the information and set up a utility and that kind of thing. Now with this pause on things, it's a little bit less time sensitive, I guess we'll say, and particularly also with going back to Paul's comments, with the amounts, per year and that kind of thing, and talking about what's acceptable for PACER ratings and stuff like that. We do have some time now to further have those discussions as well. So we'll certainly have those discussions and also not something I want to really talk about too much tonight, but with the federal infrastructure bill, we finally got guidance on that yesterday. And so at our February Public Works meeting, we'll be having a lot of discussion about how that ties into this as well. Hopefully that will help, right, to close some of the gap, at least in a short-term way. So yeah, I think with the feedback I've gotten tonight, at least we can set up the conversation with this committee as to what first this committee feels would be, reasonable, PACER rating standards for, major streets versus minor streets and that kind of thing. And then, talking about reworking the numbers. I'll tell you, if we do something less than what I've shown, there's always going to be streets and infrastructure wherever that's not maintained then, to some basic level. And we already do field a lot of calls, depending on what you think is a lot, but, we field calls and emails and complaints about when you're going to do something to my street because it's falling apart. Mm-hmm. And those will continue to happen for sure into the future, particularly if we don't, invest as much in as we needed to catch up on things. So to what level are people comfortable with that? That's something maybe we'll have to talk about as well. The other thing we should probably talk about at some point in time is maybe, ways to decrease the, cost of some of the stuff that we do. For example, bringing, like our engineering technician, we are currently out for hiring for, like having more on staff people to handle things internally rather than farming out to consultants, especially if we're going to be talking about essentially any amount of raising our current investment in infrastructure. I think it ends up making more sense to have people internally as much as possible, so long as we can show that we're making those they're staying under levy limits and all that good stuff. And then also probably something that should be discussed is then making sure we're not expanding our infrastructure commitments in ways that we're not going to be able to pay for in the future. In a lot of ways, I won't get on my soapbox too much, but in a lot of ways, suburban development doesn't pay for itself. Essentially, I think we're kind of, those chickens are coming home to roost in a lot of ways. There's a lot more roads, a lot wider roads and whatever that have been built. And, at some point in time, after a life cycle, those costs come back. And so we got to make sure that, if we expand our borders or if we're developing something else, that's an improvement to our property tax base or our future obligations rather than a future problem. so to speak. So I think those would be good conversations to have at some point in time in the future too. So.
And
Sure. And I guess, go ahead, Sarah.
I just was going to ask, and if it's not appropriate, just let me know. But the legislation that's somebody is looking to get sponsored, can you send us a copy of what the proposed legislation is, or give us the information, or send us where to look anyways?
Yeah, I will forward what I received on to you guys. So it's a very brief. I don't know that they necessarily have the bill written up. It's kind of more of a framework, I guess, for a future bill. But they're looking for sponsors right now to kind of, see if this is worth moving forward with and crafting the actual language and stuff. So I'll send that over to you guys too.
Thank you.
The other point I want to make is that I think it's true that if we don't invest now more upfront, it's going to cost us all a lot more in the long run. So this is the part of your presentation I really appreciated tonight, is the levels of trying to jump up sort of as quickly as you can, right?
Mhm.
Because then you're going to stave off for a long-term sewer problems, long-term road problems, et cetera. So again, I don't know, what is ultimately possible. I don't know
Mhm.
what all the funding sources, I don't know how that all will look, but I do think your point is really well taken, that we have to get on top of it. And that's why I think your report's so important, because I think it's really given us as a city direction in terms of this is where we need to go, right? We don't know how fast we can get there. We don't know with all these potential law changes, what that's going to look like, but you have given us a direction that makes sense. And it's just a matter of, what's going to be, there's potential everywhere, but what's going to be actually possible to do. So I really appreciate that work.
Yeah.
And is this information available on the website so we could direct citizens here so they could read up on
This
it?
report? Yeah, it's in the obviously the agenda for tonight. So people can get there. Haven't posted it anywhere specific on our website or anything like that, but yeah.
Okay.
And I can also forward you the, just the report itself too, if you needed to forward that on to anybody as well.
Okay. Anything else here any other comments that you had? Okay.
Think about.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Old business, I don't see anything on the agenda. Project update, I don't know if there's anything, Dean, that you want to check in on. Oh, Mary Claire has a
Very
question.
clear.
Sorry, Chair DeZiel, I'm just wondering, is it possible, Dean, just to send maybe the three of us that plan?
Yeah, of course.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dean, was there any project updates you want to talk about?
I just wanted to again say that we do have a lot more guidance on the federal infrastructure stuff just as of yesterday. And we will have a lot to discuss at February's meeting. It's going to be very quick turnaround with a lot of this stuff. So be prepared to to discuss and make some decisions on things soon. So
Sounds good. Sounds really good.
and I'll probably also forward you guys the memo that we received from WISTAT on it, so at least you have some idea of like what we're looking at, and then we'll give specifics on which projects we think would be worth applying for at the February meeting. So I'll forward you that memo probably tomorrow.
Thanks, Dean. Any communication, future agenda items?
Nope.
Nothing? All right. Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I will make that motion as soon as I just point out that it did say that Jim Weber was the chair, just to change that for the next time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just like a form thing, so I'll forward that along. As I mentioned to you before, I am not a wizard in the agenda software, so I will pass that along.
Evidently, I am not either. So I will make the motion that we close our meeting.
I would second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.